Welcome, everyone. My name is Jen Swanson. I'm one of the ministers at Inlet United Church in lovely Port Moody. Thank you for being here for the second of our four-part wellness speaker series that is sponsored by Inlet United Church. Originally, we had this as an in-person event at the little Ioko Heritage Church on Ioko Road, and then COVID happened. So we ended up reconfiguring and ended up being able to do this virtually, which is great because then even more people can come without having to drive. So we're very glad that you're here. And we're asking you to keep your mics on mute during the presentation, and then we'll have time at the end for a question and answer, and you can unmute them, or you can also type your questions into the chat, and I'll try and keep a handle on those and keep track of them so that we can ask at the end. I've got people joining us from Missoula, I'm not going to say it right, Missoula Lake, Burnaby, Pitt Meadows, Eagle Ridge. I know there's some Port Moody people. And before I introduce our guest, I would like to acknowledge that this event is being brought to you from the traditional and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, including the Coquitlam, the Musqueam, the Squamish, the Tsleil-Waututh, the Kwantlen, and the Katzie First Nations. And it is with gratitude that we recognize the care and the stewardship of this land down throughout the generations. So I'm just going to put you in spotlight before I introduce you. Spotlight video.
That's okay.
Do it. That's fancy. Dr. Christopher Jones is our guest tonight. He is a clinical psychologist practicing in Port Moody and in Vancouver. And I'm reading your bio. It says he grew up here in Vancouver and in the Okanagan. And he is the director of Lifespan Development Group, an organization that is committed to providing quality and evidence-based psychology services to children and adults and families. So welcome, Chris, to this talk about sleep and whatever else you're going to tell us about.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction and for this opportunity. I just finished my PowerPoint presentation, just in the nick of time. Great things are done at the last moment, apparently. Hopefully you'll agree. Sleep is not an area of specialization for me. I have a general practice. I did most of my education here in Vancouver, SFU and UBC. Had a lot of training and assessment, and only in the last 7-8 years did I really get involved in therapy. Sleep has come up a lot with my clients, of course. As a generalist, as a general practitioner, insomnia comes up in a variety of different clinical conditions. So I was happy when asked to put this together. And it's sharpened my knowledge and skills, you know, having been forced to put together a coherent presentation for all of you. So I'll just start by sharing my screen. Yes, click that little blue one.
Yeah.
Good.
Now it is.
Okay. Very good. So today I'll be talking about sleep and wellness more generally. The subtitle is two major approaches to sleep and wellness. Well, sleep primarily. The more traditional, the more long-standing approach is called cognitive behavioral. You'll notice we psychologists really like our jargon. And so cognitive behavioral just refers to, you know, really thinking carefully about behaviors, associations with behavior that we make. And of course, those associations are cognitive, right? So there's a lot of focus on learning. The other approach is newer, acceptance-based approaches to sleep. Are newer and were originally thought of as a kind of an add-on to the dominant approach to treating insomnia, both primary insomnia, if that's the main or presenting problem, and secondary insomnia. As I mentioned earlier, insomnia comes up for a lot of different, for a lot of folks that are struggling with other things primarily, for example, anxiety, depression, hormonal changes associated with getting older, and some other conditions that I'll mention. So I'm just going to change the slide. So just to give you an overview, someone taught me in grad school to tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So I'm going to try to stick to that simple rule. First, we're going to talk about the 4 physical factors for health and wellness. I welcome any argument that there are just 4. Certainly, there's probably more than 4, but there's 4 that I really tend to think about when I'm talking to clients about lifestyle changes associated with not just psychological health, but wellness more generally. So then we're going to talk about the functions of sleep. Many of you are probably familiar with this. We'll just go over it quickly. And the consequences of poor sleep. We all have firsthand experience of that, but it's good to go over what's been researched and documented in the literature. The highlight in green there is because when we get to the punchline of my presentation, I'm going to really want to stress that it's important not to get too tangled up in worry thoughts about not getting enough sleep. As it turns out, those worry thoughts can often perpetuate sleeplessness because when we worry about things, our nervous system gets involved, and that activation, of course, can perpetuate insomnia or worsen insomnia. So that's a big, that's a punchline of my presentation. I could perhaps stop there. We're going to talk about disruptors of sleep, and then of course we're going to get into these solutions, the psychological approaches to sleeplessness. And I've already mentioned the 2 big ones. Those are the bottom 2. The first 2 that I'm mentioning are the interrelations among the 4 health factors. Talk about that. Medications and herbal or naturopathic remedies. I know we have another expert in the wellness series who can talk more about that. I'm just going to touch on that briefly, not get myself into trouble. And then, of course, I'll be spending most of the time on the CBT, or the cognitive behavioral approach, and the acceptance and commitment therapy approach, which you'll soon gather I'm in favor of. So moving forward. So the 4 physical health and wellness factors that I tend to focus on with clients is I usually do start with sleep. Not just, stressing the importance of sleep, but really doing a thorough assessment of how my client, how my patient is currently sleeping, not just the amount, but the regularity of sleep, the quality of sleep, looking at different forms of insomnia, whether it's, trouble getting to sleep, waking up in the middle of the night, or early waking. And all of those different problems tend to come up. I'm just going to close my kitchen window. Someone's chosen this time to do some construction. I have a helper doing that for me, so that's helpful. So yeah, the other 3 health factors: nutrition, and I've lumped in hydration there. Exercise and stress management, you might argue, is not really a physical health factor. And of course, it's a big part of clinical psychological practice. But I've listed it as a physical health factor because of the rapid physical impact. So I really want to stress a number of times in today's presentation, how stress very quickly impacts you physically in terms of a physical body response, namely the sympathetic nervous system, or the gas pedal of the nervous system, if you will, the one that keeps us awake. And the other aspect of that is the endocrine system getting involved when we perceive something as threatening. And sleeplessness is one of those things that we can perceive as threatening. As I said earlier, that can really perpetuate sleeplessness when we regard being not asleep as a problem. And then, of course, there's synergy and interrelations between these physical health factors. When you're eating well and staying well hydrated, your brain is happier, and therefore you're managing stress better, and therefore you're probably sleeping better. right? So any positive behavior change in any of these areas is probably going to have synergistic interactive effects on some of the other areas. Jen, would you like it if I paused for questions periodically, or would you like there to be, maybe 2 or 3 question periods? What would you like? What's worked for you guys in the past with other presentations?
We just did a question and answer at the end, but if
Okay.
somebody has a burning question, they might want to pop
Okay.
it into the chat and then.
Okay, sure.
Yeah.
I can't see the chat right now. Let's see here. Once I turned on my screen sharing, I can't see the chat. So if you would please verbally let me know. I can see everybody, but I can't see the chat window. So, if
I will
anyone
let
has
you know for sure. Don't worry. I was just dealing with a ringing phone here.
Oh, okay. So the functions of sleep, as we know, when we don't get a good sleep, we often don't feel quite right the next day. Of course, first and foremost, you notice that you're tired, you have less energy, but there's some real important changes that happen primarily to the frontal lobes of the brain, regulating attention, and that can result in missing things, making more of those inattentive errors, so-called careless errors. They're not really careless, right? They're more lapses in sustained attention, and those can have varying consequences. Regulation of emotional response, so people are often more irritable, less able to control their emotions more generally when they don't get enough sleep. And impulsivity is more of a problem when you haven't slept well. So impulsive behaviors, particularly if you're struggling with something, be it impulsive eating or driving fast, or other forms of behavior that you're trying to exert. Perhaps you're at a stage in your life when you're trying to exert conscious control over that behavior. You'll be a little bit less good at that if you haven't slept well. The highlighted statement there, executive function, is this broader term that refers to frontal lobe functions, the conscious control in the service of goals. So when we're using executive function, we're trying to control our attention to do a good job at work or whatever the task may be. We're trying to control our emotional responses to preserve our relationships, get along well with people. We're trying to control our behavior. All of these controls, are typically conscious, and we're doing them for the sake of some goal. So executive function is the fancy psychological jargon for that. It's executive because it's top down, it's conscious, and it's in the service of goals. It's been said that executive function is a finite resource. We only have so much self-control in the day, and it's a renewable resource. And guess what restores executive control? It's good sleep, right? So if you have an easy day where you're not particularly challenged in regulating attention or control over your feelings or behavior, you might find that you're well able to resist that second bowl of ice cream after dinner. But if you've had a taxing day where you were with someone who was quite irritating and they were really taxing your ability to control your feelings, you might find that you don't have executive control left over after dinner. So research has really borne this out, that executive control is a finite but renewable resource, and of course quality sleep is something that really serves that renewing. And there's additional functions of sleep. This is a really interesting area of the research literature, that sleep serves to consolidate memory. So I often experience this as a student. If I divided my studying across many nights instead of cramming at the last minute for an exam, I would find I was just a lot more efficient in my studying. And the basis for that is when you sleep on stuff that you've memorized, you consolidate it. There's an activity that takes place during sleep such that those memories are more accessible and they're more well put together and organized. So it really does pay off to have a good sleep, study a moderate amount and then sleep on it, study some more across several days of studying, rather than what a lot of students do is that last minute cram the night before. And then of course showing up late, showing up tired for the exam the next day. That's a recipe for suboptimal functioning, although it can get you through. There's a whole literature on the function of dreaming. I thought we wouldn't get into that. It's very interesting to me. If you guys are curious about it, we can talk about it at the end of the presentation. It's a bit kind of a sidebar from the focus of today. If sleep is important for consolidating memory, that doesn't just apply to a student who's trying to do well on an exam. That applies to all the learning that we do through the day. Learning experiences that we have with people. Learning how to get along with a particularly difficult someone. All types of learning and therefore memory, the ability to access that learning and apply it. It all depends on this consolidation function to some extent. It's all, I should say, facilitated by getting a good sleep. So over time, it is really important to get a good sleep so that you can profit from every day's experience and make use of that learning in the next day. So I hope that all made sense. So sleep problems, this is US data. I did look for Canadian data, but you can just probably divide, I'm sure some of these statistics are equivalent. The cost of the healthcare system in the United States for sleep problems, for primary insomnia, was estimated to be 12 billion. That's probably 1 billion in the Canadian healthcare system. We are spending a lot of money on sleep medication, and that's both over-the-counter as well as prescription, typically anxiety medications that are addressed at the underlying anxiety that's behind insomnia. And then, of course, there's all the lost productivity costs, which are hard to calculate, and some of the other costs associated with workplace accidents and other kinds of accidents. Insomnia, chronic insomnia is thought to affect a good chunk of the population. This is US data, 9 to 15%, and then more so for the elderly population, as I was saying earlier, the hormonal changes. And then there's another chunk of the population that's having temporary or transient insomnia at some points in their lives. So they would be interested to learn what they can do about it as well. So it turns out that the model we have for primary insomnia is a conditioned bedtime arousal, all other things being in the normal range. If you're not experiencing a transient insignificant change in hormones, primary insomnia is usually the result of conditioned bedtime arousal. And what that means is as you start to develop a sleep problem, you start to go to bed already with heightened anxiety about the possibility of not sleeping. And that anxiety results in nervous system arousal, and the problem just unfolds over time, and people can get really entrenched in that problem. It's hard for researchers to separate primary insomnia from secondary insomnia that might be due to depression and anxiety issues. Oftentimes, clients present to a psychologist or to their family doctor looking for treatment of primary anxiety, and there is something else going on, but they might not be reporting that in the first or second visit. They might not be aware, but oftentimes I find these problems are always intermixed. There's usually another worry or rumination type problem that's co-occurring with insomnia. Worry refers to, well, we all know what worry is. You don't need me to define that. But rumination is usually backwards looking. It's It's replaying old hurts or current things that are not up to standard, or current aspects of your life that are not the way you'd like them to be. So that's what, this is the jargon that psychologists use to separate out future-oriented distressing thoughts from past and present-oriented distressing thoughts. It is helpful to separate those out a bit so that you can recognize when you're doing it. It's very much a human thing to do. You don't have to have a clinical diagnosis to do this. Humans have this huge cortex, right? We can represent threats from the past, as we often tend to do, some of us anyway. We've got this great worry is actually more of a functional mental activity, where you're presenting a possible unwanted outcome, and it's supposed to direct you to engage in planning. And if it does, then that's a healthy thing to do. But oftentimes worry thoughts are orienting your attention to something you've already done the planning, or you're not planning. And the worry thought is not orienting your attention to take action that would really take care of the problem, but rather you're just kind of spinning your wheels. And while you're doing that, you're engaging in a mental process that turns on that sympathetic nervous system, turns on the endocrine aspect of threat response, which is the release of adrenaline, cortisol, and so forth. And those are the two components. That's this third bullet point here. The perception of threat is done by the mind. Oftentimes the threat is not here right now. It's a threat from the past. It's an old hurt. It's a threat from the present, but it's not here right now. It's something about your life that you don't like, and you're going over it again, as if one more trip around the block is going to make it better. Or it's a threat from the future. It's not here yet, but again, doing that circular processing. And you're turning on your sympathetic nervous system and the endocrine aspect of threat response. And this is very much the driving force behind insomnia for a lot of people. And if it's primary insomnia, then the primary threat that you're thinking about is not sleeping. If it's secondary insomnia, then you have a more pervasive problem of orienting to threats that are not here right now. And perhaps sleeplessness is just one of those threats. Okay, so I noticed I'm talking really fast. I'll just slow it down a bit. Another problem that gets in the way of sleep is simple behavioral choice. I mean, we have free will, right? Some people, they have trouble going to bed at the right time, at the time that they know they should go to bed. And there can be a lot of reasons for that. In general, it's some kind of trouble letting go of the day. Not wanting to say goodbye to the day, not wanting to cut short your enjoyment time. Perhaps you're in a situation in your life where your enjoyment is limited by a lot of work. This is often true of new parents. They do their child care, and maybe they have a part-time job, and then there's meals and all that stuff, and then the kid finally goes to sleep, and now it's your time, right? And who wants to cut that short when it's already been cut short? Finally, I've noted troubles with delay of gratification. So I have clients who their enjoyment time isn't really limited by any pressing life circumstance, and yet they still struggle with letting go of enjoyable activities like binge watching Netflix, or a lot of YouTube, surfing, video games, things like that, behavioral addictions. And they know they should go to bed now, but they have trouble with delaying gratification. So that's a primary problem that I bump into a lot in my clinical practice, and we can talk more about that if you guys have questions. Okay, so wow, we're at 7:30 already. So we should be a quarter of the way through my slides. Okay, solutions. Solutions for insomnia, whether it's primary or secondary. Um, Stress management is going to come up for all clients with insomnia, whether it's primary or secondary. So that's one of the physical health factors. Growing evidence that nutrition and gut health are particularly important in general wellness, in particular psychological wellness, and even more particularly in executive function of self-control. It's really important to get the building blocks, to provide your brain with the building blocks to make those neurotransmitters, so you don't have to go get a prescription to sort of artificially increase a particular neurotransmitter. You can often, or at least you should try to maximize your attention to nutrition and gut health first. And certainly there are people who need that prescription. I'm certainly not down on the need for medical attention, but we should certainly try to maximize these physical health factors first. And then if there's still a problem, I would recommend seeking prescription to help. Hydration and brain health, there's a lot of research on that. Even mild dehydration has a big impact on these executive functions that I keep talking about. Self-control, which you need to go to bed on time, which you need to manage stress properly, so that you don't get caught up in this primary insomnia problem where you're stressed about going to bed and the possibility of not sleeping well. Oftentimes people don't have a strong enough thirst indicator for when they need to drink water. So most medical doctors will tell you to pay attention to the color of your urine, to maintain that clear pale green color that we've heard so many times. So that's a real thing, and it affects brain health, of course, not just general wellness. I found an article in my preparation for today that exercise, particularly in the morning, is related to greater releases of melatonin. You've probably heard of melatonin as a sleep aid. I'm going to talk more about how it actually works. It's actually a naturally occurring chemical in your body that helps you establish the biorhythm of sleep and wake. So it does help sleep for a lot of people, but it does so indirectly by setting your body's clock to have a natural sleep and wake cycle. So I'm not sure, the research didn't really control for, was it the exercise or was it people getting sun on their face in the morning? Because that can help set your body's clock too. Both are probably good. So getting out for that morning walk can be really good for you. I've copied the reference at the bottom of the page for you. You can check that research out for yourself. The final note there is that I've been looking into high intensity interval training. That's not an option for everybody, but you can engage in, rather than a steady state, very low intensity exercise, to the extent that you can, it may be helpful to introduce bursts of more intense exertion. Like if you have a half an hour walk, you might want to have early in the half hour, you might want to have a burst of slightly more intense, take a hill slightly faster than you might have. All of this should be, you should check with your medical doctor. You should use judgment in any sort of interval training or bursts of more extreme exertion. But there may be something special about bursts of exertion, the way they impact the endocrine system, and then subsequently stress management and sleep. So I don't have to go into a lot of detail about this. Melatonin, as I was saying, promotes sleep via the sleep-wake cycle. What also helps, if you're taking melatonin to help sleep, you should take it about an hour before desired onset of sleep, 1 or 2 hours before. Follow your medical doctor if he disagrees with me. Avoid bright light at night. So that includes screens or other sources of bright light. You don't want to because that's messing with your body's ability to establish that sleep-wake cycle. Also, getting sun on your face in the morning. Research supports that. This other article supports getting sun on your face while exercising. It's not clear what the active ingredient is there. It's probably both. So these are lifestyle changes, and psychologists often do work with people to change behavior, to induce motivation, to take care of any thoughts and feelings that are getting in the way of these lifestyle changes. So I guess that's why I thought of including these in my presentation. I'm not trying to be a medical doctor here. I'm definitely not, but lifestyle change is something that medical doctors can recommend, and then I can be the one to help create the motivation to make that happen. So now we come to the major gist of the focus of my presentation, and that is strictly psychological approaches to improving sleep, to improving, especially in cases of primary insomnia. It also works for secondary insomnia. Just at this point, I would like to open up to any questions so that I can guide my my presentation from this point. I can perhaps tailor it a bit for anyone who has a particular question or is perhaps struggling with a particular sleep difficulty. So I just want to open it up to any questions or particular, personal experiences of sleep difficulty. Does anyone want to be brave?
You'll have to unmute yourself if you want to ask a question, or type it in the chat, whichever way you'd like to do it. I'm really glad you brought up the gut health.
Okay.
And
yeah.
Thankfully, we have someone coming on to our presentation at the very end of the last week doing a whole thing on gut health. But
okay.
I appreciate that.
Great, great. So I see a lot of people here are muted. Actually, I'm not sure what that means. Okay. All right, so no questions? We're good?
I think so. I don't know. Does anybody have a question?
Okay.
There were some questions coming in the chat.
Oh,
okay. Hang on, let me look. I gotta move it over here. Broken sleep is my concern. And I have trouble waking up in the middle of the night, 3 a.m. and getting back to sleep. Those are the two of the questions.
Okay.
We avoid naps.
Someone else is asking if we should avoid naps.
Good question. There are different opinions on that. Just briefly, I'll certainly come back to that question.
Yeah, so two questions about broken sleep and one about avoiding naps. Anybody else have a question at this time?
Okay. So broken sleep, the jargon term for that is middle insomnia. And what turns out to be important from a psychological point of view, I know medical doctors pay a lot of attention to early insomnia, middle insomnia, or early waking. These can have different indications. So it's important to, when you come to your medical doctor, to have a clear, it can be helpful to keep a sleep diary and have a clear accounting of what your particular sleep problem is. Middle insomnia can be very frustrating, particularly it becomes a psychological issue if you're waking up and you're bothered by that and frustrated in getting back to sleep. Middle insomnia can result from carrying stresses during the day. And perhaps it's coming up in dream content, or it's coming up in other ways and waking you early. Perhaps your nervous system is keyed up. Perhaps you have not established you don't have a well-established rhythm for the sleep-wake cycle that I was mentioning earlier. So broken sleep, middle insomnia can be really helped by by that lifestyle factor. Establishing regularity of bedtime, regularity of wake time. Um, One group that I'm going to talk about are going to recommend that you be very strict about bedtime and wake time and to get up even if you've had a bad sleep. And that's serving the interest of establishing that regularity of sleep-wake cycle. You may want to take melatonin if your doctor advises it. Certainly, you can get up, as regularly as you can. You can be as strict as you want. I'm in favor of some degree of flexibility. It can be very helpful to get sunshine on your face in the morning, to do morning exercise, and to avoid light, up to 2 hours before bedtime. The melatonin question is one for your medical doctor, but it can really clinch the setting of a regular sleep-wake cycle that's not interrupted by middle insomnia. Middle insomnia can point to other medical problems specifically, and you should really take that up with your doctor. The other question about naps, well, as I've already alluded to, different approaches to treating sleep call for different degrees of strictness. I'm going to end up arguing for some latitude around naps. I don't think we need to be as strict as the CBTI group is going to argue, and we're about to get into that content. You'll see on the slide in front of you, one of the points is sleep restriction and stimulus control. So those two are talking about a very strict approach. So the CBT for insomnia group are going to argue that you avoid naps. And then the next guy I'm going to introduce to you is going to say, oh, all those rules are out the window. I'm going to finish off with a moderate approach and say, no, I don't think all those rules are out the window. You should, as best you can, you should think about this regularity of sleep-wake. But if you really need to sleep and there's something important that you need to be rested for, then I would go ahead and take that down. Did that prompt any more questions in the chat?
Someone commented, often waking at 4 a.m. becomes part of the pattern.
Yeah. So early waking is associated with, it often happens at the transition, menopause for women, just more of a steady state, more of a gradual change for men. It can happen quite abruptly for women at the time, which is shortly after menopause. It can happen more gradually for men as they move through that 6th decade of life. The person asking, is this a new thing? Did it suddenly come on board, or has it been with them for many years?
I don't know.
Okay, that's fine.
Another comment that might relate to this is sleep patterns and naps for those working on night shift, day shift, like healthcare workers.
Yeah. Well, shift work is really difficult. There really is a very, you can't argue with the need for a regular sleep wake cycle. If it must be a nighttime cycle where you're often sleeping during the day, then it's not ideal. The ideal is sleeping at night and being awake during the day. It's slightly less ideal to have a shifted pattern, and it's even less ideal to have a random pattern where sometimes you're sleeping at night and sometimes you're sleeping in the day. But you can still optimize to the best that you can. And hopefully, you're being compensated for that shift work. Hopefully, perhaps you're moving towards, less of a varying sleep schedule. You're working your way up in a union job or otherwise. Certainly, there's no arguing with the fact that sleeping at night is the best. If you can't do that, then regularity of sleep is important. And if you can't do that, then you should be thinking about moving towards that as soon as you can. So that's hard to hear for someone who has no choice. And those are the only shifts, that's the only type of work that's available. It's just the truth of the matter, the difficult truth.
The person who asked about the waking at 4 a.m. said it's related to partner's work schedule and
Okay.
anticipation of their worries.
Okay. Oh, I see. Anticipation of the partner's work schedules. Sorry, the partner's worries. Okay, I'm going to speak to that in a few minutes. If I forget to explicitly reference it, please remind me. So I'll press on then. So I'm introducing, as I said earlier, the strict approach, the strict psychological treatment, the one where they get really tough about taking naps and not associating your bed only with sleep and perhaps sexual activity, if that's happening. So CBTI is it's a structured, manualized treatment. Therapists who are doing this treatment are usually working from a particular protocol. CBT is the most well-researched approach to psychological problems. It's the mainstream approach. By far, most psychologists are working within this tradition, but not all. And there's varying degrees of adherence to the strictness. But one thing about CBT is, in order to research a particular approach, you have to have a large number of people who are being treated in exactly the same way. And that, it's in the interest of it's in the interest of scientific validation that we stick to the manual. So you really often get a very hard line and strict approach to doing things a particular way. So the 6 components of CBT for insomnia usually begins with some sessions. Much as I've tried to educate you about sleep and its disruption, some more detail in that. You're often encouraged or required to keep a sleep diary. I think that's generally a good idea. Whether or not you think your sleeplessness is coming from a medical problem, or if it's primary insomnia, it can be really good to really get a sense of the problem. How often is it occurring, rather than to go into your doctor with a not so clear sense. Sleep hygiene rules just refer to some specifics like avoiding caffeine, some common sense things like that. Sleep restriction is about the strictness of really trying to match that sleep-wake cycle, even if you haven't slept well. And that can be really tough to stick with. But a CBTI therapist will strongly encourage you to stick with that. Stimulus control, we'll talk about that in a sec. Cognitive restructuring, I'll say more about that when we get into detail. CBTI may or may not include relaxation therapy and training. So a good example of that is various breathing techniques that are aimed at relaxing you, specifically shutting down or dampening the threat response, the emotional threat response. It turns out the only access we have to the parasympathetic nervous system, which is kind of like the brakes. If the sympathetic is the gas pedal, and it gets turned on when your mind perceives a problem or a threat, the parasympathetic is the brake pedal. And when parasympathetic is activated, you calm down, your breathing returns to normal, your heart rate, your blood pressure, adrenaline and cortisol are no longer released. And the body returns to doing other things, to taking care of internal functions. The primary being sleep, but also cell repair, flushing wastes, bringing nutrients to cells. For men, sexual activity can only happen when we're in that parasympathetic mode. that's very relevant to other things. So sympathetic activation is incompatible with sexual activity for men, and it's incompatible with sleep for everyone. So let's carry on. So education, you know, this is kind of interesting, and this is usually a component of education. You want to educate the patient when you're introducing them to all these strict rules about how we're going to try to get sleep back on track. With the education, you can often increase motivation for sticking to these difficult rules. So clearly life has changed over the last couple of thousand years. Today, you know, there's a lot less going out in the morning. You know, shift work, I don't think was a big thing a couple of thousand years ago, or it was at least less common. You know, we were primarily doing things outside during the day, and the lights were off at night. So with the arrival of modern life and technology and all the changes that that's brought, we've disrupted our sleep-wake cycle. We are creatures that are meant to be awake in the day, and we're meant to be sleeping at night. So we've got all these new technology tools. You know, the phone is something you should probably not have at your night table. One of the things that a lot of people with insomnia do is pick up the phone and entertain themselves. It can actually work because, you know, you take your mind off of worry thoughts, and you might be able to entertain yourself with a, you know, with a TV show or some other form of entertainment. But there's that bright light in your face, and furthermore, it's really, you know, a control strategy, right? So you're reaching for something, you know, you're reaching for something as a way to get sleepy, and then a lot of people will use the phone to seek entertainment, and then they'll check and see how sleepy they are, and they might start to get frustrated if that control strategy is not working. Education for insomnia usually includes this concept about arousal, how bedtime becomes perceived as a threat. For people who are well entrenched in insomnia, going to bed, they already start to feel anxious about the possibility of having another non-optimal sleep. For someone who's been struggling with middle insomnia, you might get a little bit of that, but it'll tend to come on more strongly when you actually wake up in the middle of the night. And there's that first thought, oh, here we go again, right? Even that thought alone is enough. Believe it or not, you won't experience a fight or flight response, but having the thought, here we go again, is enough to turn on the sympathetic nervous system just enough to keep you awake a little longer than you would have been had you noticed and been able to fully accept that. Okay, well, this is what's happening right now. I don't love this, but this is what's happening. What can I do in this moment to orient to non-threatening thoughts, to accept my emotional state, to accept sleeplessness? So I was saying that the highlighted point, it's really important for clients who are struggling with insomnia, who are engaging with treatment. It's important for them to understand the mechanism of insomnia, you know, provided it's not directly the result of a medical condition. That insomnia is, if it's a primary insomnia, it's the result of regarding bedtime or sleeplessness as a threat. And when you do that, it turns on your nervous system. Even if you don't feel it, even if you don't feel anxiously aroused, if you're irritated or bothered, or, you know, you're starting to have thoughts about how tomorrow's going to be because you didn't sleep well, those thoughts are about perceiving a threat to sleeplessness, or even, you know, the context of going to bed. And that is the primary psychological mechanism for being awake when it's time to sleep. So CBT usually begins with this educational component. You know, a few sessions would be spent on that. I already talked about the sleep diary, so that would be the next thing to focus on. Most therapists would ask you to track the problem, whether it's sleeplessness or panic attacks or episodes of anxiety or mood diaries, these kinds of things. Most psychologists will want to do some, even those that are not this strict about things. Most psychologists will ask you to track the problem. If you haven't already tracked it, your first session, you'll be asked to start some kind of a journal or a diary to keep track. And in this case, you're tracking your sleep. And not just not just the quality of your sleep or the amount of sleep that you had, but also we want to calculate sleep efficiency, especially if you're a strict CBT therapist for insomnia. You're going to want to count the time sleeping. There's apps that can help with that, like your Fitbit. Somehow cell phones are able to do that, but I don't want your cell phone in the bedroom. I don't know how they do that when you're not holding them, but somehow they do. So you want to calculate time spent asleep as a function of time spent in bed, and from there you get this quotient of sleep efficiency. Good. Also, when the client brings their sleep diary into that first or second session, you'll often, as a therapist, you'll often be able to hear the way they talk about nights that are good and bad. As we get to the last, what I think is the compromise, is the most sensible compromise for treating insomnia. It's important to get the client's language, the language that clients use about good and bad nights. Simply categorizing a night as bad. As I said earlier, when the mind perceives threat, it turns on the nervous system, and it's not helping to restore proper sleep, because the mind perceives threat, the nervous system turns on. Okay. Sorry, the print's getting a little small. Hope it's still readable. So CBT often starts with these sleep hygiene rules. And I think that these are sensible, and I have no problem with most of these. So limiting caffeine intake, it just makes sense, right? Avoiding screens and other bright lights up to 2 hours before bedtime. And then the converse, getting that bright sunshine on your face in the morning, probably exercise, also potentiating that. These things are going to help to set a regular sleep-wake cycle, which is a fundamental biorhythm, a circadian rhythm. Regularizing your eating might be helpful. Not getting too strict about this, but nighttime eating. I think we've all soaked this up from social media now, that nighttime eating isn't so good for you. It's not good for sleep. It's not good for other reasons too. I've noticed a new fad that's spreading, and that's intermittent fasting. From what I gather, there's good evidence for doing this, perhaps within reason. You don't have to go to the full, 8-hour window, and then the 16 hours of fasting. You don't necessarily have to go there. Any sort of change, particularly if it's an extreme change, like doing the 8-16 intermittent fasting, you should definitely talk to your doctor about that before starting that. But there is some evidence already in the literature that this kind of regularizing of your feeding cycle, it's another biorhythm. So digestion being a rhythmic activity, if you make that rhythmic, you're going to help to make your sleep cycle rhythmic as well. CBT for insomnia often includes very strict rules about limiting limiting time spent in bed to actual sleep time. So for example, you'll be quite strict about bedtime, plus or minus 15 minutes or 30 minutes. It sounds pretty strict, right? Getting up after 15 minutes of sleeplessness, and actually doing tasks, whether it's paperwork tasks or quiet household tasks, being considerate of others who might be sleeping. You return to bed only when you really feel sleepy. So the idea here, we don't want you lying in bed, being sleepless and perhaps having negative thoughts about being sleepless. That's not good. Because as you get hooked into that thought process, your nervous system is going to become aroused, and that's going to keep you not sleeping. So a lot of clients who are doing this approach have trouble with that. Even though they're not sleeping, they don't want to get up. They're tired, and getting up is unpleasant. We're going to talk about an approach to fostering willingness to have the discomfort of following these strict rules. Finally, you're not allowed to nap. So someone asked that question, and perhaps you've heard it somewhere that naps are not good. You're essentially messing up the cycle. Many of us who have parented children, we have that concept. We've soaked it up from other parents. The notion that if you let your kid nap too long, he or she's going to be up late. There's truth to that, right? You want to establish regularity. If there is going to be a nap, it should be a regular nap, and it should only be happening for persons who are not already struggling with insomnia. So I'm not necessarily advocating the strictness of this. As I mentioned earlier, I'm going to come to a softer approach. But if you're following this approach, and a lot of people, they do try this strict approach first, and then if it doesn't work, they look for something a little different. Stimulus control just refers to associating your bed only with sleep, perhaps with sexual activity, but not reading in bed. So if you want to read, you have to go to an armchair, or you're not meant to lie in bed, because that's creating an association of bed with non-sleeping activities. Pretty strict, hey? Stressing, of course, and stressing about not sleeping in particular are forbidden. If that's happening, you're meant to get up, no matter how uncomfortable that might be. Finally, there are a number of sessions in CBTI that are aimed at cognitive restructuring. So I read about a case study. There was this fella who was a bit, he was particular, as a lot of us can be. And he was particular about getting that perfect night's sleep. And paradoxically, his particularness about that was creating more intense distress than the average person would experience about, getting only 6 hours or 6.5 hours. And so not only would that often impair sleep, paradoxically, but it would cause him stress the next day. He would be irritable, wouldn't be as nice to his wife or his kids, a little bit more difficult at work, and that chronic stress through the day was sort of potentiated by not getting that perfect amount of sleep, and of course that chronic stress was feeding back into could feed back into middle insomnia, as one person wrote earlier. So chronic stress through the day can show up as early waking, or middle insomnia, or trouble getting to sleep. So here's the paradox of someone who really cares about sleep being a little too particular about getting that perfect sleep, therefore having more distress than is warranted about a suboptimal night of sleep, and paradoxically having a worsening course over time, increasing problems of sleeplessness as a result of caring so much about it. So CBT is I don't know if I included that note earlier. CBT really works. So research is consistent in showing that it works it works better than medication. Where is that? Yeah, so it's research proven. It's equal to medication at the end of the clinical trial, randomized clinical trials. So the gold standard, right? Equal to medication at the short term at the end of the study. And, you know, if there's a 6-month or 1-year follow-up, this intervention is better than medication. So the group that had just CBTI and no medication fared better at the 6-month or 1-year follow-up. So there's no doubt that it works. And of course, psychologists love it when they have something that works as well as or even better than medication, right? So we got a problem though with the group of patients who are not helped by CBTI. I don't know if there's anyone out there who's been to a psychologist and tried this strict approach. Is there anyone out there who has tried it? No? Okay. Well, not everyone responds to CBTI, so we really have to think about those people. We can't just rest on our laurels of having beaten medication in these clinical trials. We want to take care of non-responders. You know, oftentimes you formed a bond with the client. Of course, you want to reach for other things to help the client if you haven't already done so. So what do we do in those cases? Some therapists will start with a strict CBTI approach and then shift gears if necessary if the client is not a responder. So that's been the case for me. Although I've settled in the last year or two to a kind of a compromise approach. I think pulling the best from CBTI and also being a bit softer with some of these stimulus control and sleep restriction rules. So I want to talk a little bit of a sidebar. I want to open up my discussion to, in order to introduce acceptance and commitment therapy as a treatment for sleep problems, I want to introduce you to acceptance and commitment therapy as a general approach. It just seemed necessary to orient you to some big differences. It's regarded as a behavioral therapy. I think it's really, it's the next iteration of CBT, right? It's not so much focused on changing your thoughts, but rather your relationship to your thoughts and feelings. Not so much changing the content of thoughts, but rather changing the way you relate to thoughts that might have content that's unhelpful. Another big difference with ACT therapy is there's less emphasis on categorical diagnosis. Earlier we were talking about people with primary insomnia versus secondary. That categorical putting people into cubby holes doesn't work so well as I've found as I've gained more experience. Most people have, you know, if they present with insomnia as their primary complaint, they oftentimes have other troubles with worry and rumination that they might not even be aware of. That they're often fused with worry thoughts. This is creating a more of a general problem with stress management that could be manifesting as one of the 3 types of insomnia when they show up for that first appointment. With ACT therapy, we're not so much focused on diagnosis at all, but rather the human condition, right? And really, you probably heard of positive psychology. Some of that gets a little carried away, but we are focused on processes related to health and value-guided action. Because when when you're finding that you can function well and you can act in ways that serve your values, a lot of diagnoses tend to fade away, certainly in prominence. The goal of ACT therapy is psychological flexibility, which is defined by 6 processes. So you know, you probably heard about this mindfulness fad. I almost wish it wasn't such a fad because a lot of people have heard of it. They regard it as a fad, and so they're a little bit skeptical when I use the word mindfulness or meditation. ACT therapy focuses on, as I said, 6 processes, and they form this hexagon, if you will. On the left side are mindfulness and acceptance-based processes. So these are skills, if you will, or mental processes that I'm encouraging clients to develop. On the right side, we have processes that are more about action. And, you know, so you could argue that mindfulness and acceptance are only useful if they permit you to act in ways that serve your values, that permit you to move towards the life that you want to have. In this case, we're talking about a life that includes restful sleep. So you'll notice the overlap. So contact with the present moment is very helpful to value-guided action, or, you know, commitment and behavior change. Behavior change implying that there is some problem with behavior, and we want to shift behavior to be more in line with our values. Values being defined as the things that we want our life to have or to be about. So the other behavior change processes are values, being clear about your values, knowing what you want, and then being willing to commit to action. In brackets are all the sort of opposites, right? So if you're not able to make contact with the present moment, it means you're not fully present. You're often engaged with the conceptualized past, you know, regarding yourself as this or that. A very benign example would be a client coming in saying, I'm not good at math. So, you know, the client has come to identify him or herself as someone who is not good at math. That's a good example of a conceptualized, being fused with a conceptualized version of yourself. So with regard to treatment of insomnia, we want to focus on acceptance of primarily sleeplessness, the ability to notice thoughts that are getting in the way of sleep, to be able to defuse from those thoughts. So once you've noticed a thought, oh, I'm having the thought that tomorrow is going to be messed up because I'm not getting a good sleep. You can now have thoughts about your thoughts. Once you've defused from a thought, you can think about the functional impact of that thought. You can think, well, if I continue to think that way, will it move me towards my values? In general, that's the question you want to ask. So rather than trying to change thoughts, we're changing our relationship to thoughts. We're stepping back from thoughts and we're asking, is that thought going to move me in the direction that I want? I've often had the thought that this system, this approach to mental health or psychological flexibility is quite consistent with Christian values, or with a lot of clients who come to me with other religious faiths, because, you know, there is often an emphasis on values. So they really like that this whole system is rooted in values and value-guided action. So if you can accept your experience in the service of value-guided action, if you can defuse from thoughts and ask that fundamental question, regardless of the truth of this thought, if I continue to think about this, does it move me in the direction of my values? Right? That's a very helpful question to ask. There are a lot of true thoughts that do not need to be thunk right now. A lot of true thoughts that do not need to be overturned yet again in your mind. One of them is reflecting on the consequences of not sleeping. So sorry for that long-winded introduction. You can see I'm very passionate about this approach, and I do tend to ramble on. Good thing this is not a therapy session. I wouldn't be a very good therapist. The value that we're talking about here, of course, is health and wellness, and specifically about having a good sleep. Becoming fused with thoughts about what's going to happen if I don't sleep well tonight? Not accepting the experience of sleeplessness, as we noted earlier, if we really get tangled up in not liking that, our body's going to become aroused emotionally, and it's going to worsen the problem. So we're going to be trying to dig ourselves out of a hole with a shovel. So initially, ACT therapy was conceptualized as an add-on to CBTI. It was, for the sake of our value, getting a good sleep, we're going to use ACT to increase the client's willingness to do all those hard things, to skip naps even when you're brutally tired, to get out of bed after 15 minutes of non-sleep, even though you don't feel like it. We're going to use ACT, and particularly, this piece about acceptance of experience, making contact with what is the case right now, emotions, sensations, experiences that are unpleasant, and increasing the client's willingness to have those unpleasant experiences for the sake of treatment success. So I like this initial attempt at bringing together ACT therapy with an established method that really does work. And it did help with a lot of those non-responders that we spoke about earlier. A lot of those CBTI clients who were in that group that didn't respond, perhaps didn't respond to medication either. So research showed that this, using ACT in this way, it was effective in getting clients to do the hard stuff. Next came a more radical application of ACT, and I've given you the link here, and you can follow this link if you're able to copy and paste it. I don't know if it's a dynamic link for you watching this. It is for my cursor.
Yeah, no, it's not.
Okay, well, I guess you'll have to manually. Well, I guess what I'll do is I'll provide a bit later tonight. I'll submit a list of references that are clickable, so that make that a little easier for you. So Dr. Guy Meadows has a sleep clinic in London, England, and he's taken a more radical application of ACT methods, and he makes a lot of sense. But he's tossed the rules, completely out the window, right? So he let go of all the rules of CBTI. You're allowed to have naps. You don't have to, follow any of this. He doesn't like a lot of these rules because he regards them as control strategies. He's really thinking of the non-responders. So a lot of people that come to his clinic are people who have not responded to this more established approach, CBT approach. And it makes a lot of sense when he talks about, clients they're engaged in CBT and they're evaluating. They're just one of those types of people that really need to control their experience. And maybe they're being quite compliant with CBTI. They're following all the rules, but they're so busy evaluating the effectiveness such that when they have a sleepless night or a non-optimal sleep, they become very quickly threatened by that. So this monitoring the gap between what you have and what you want, we've got a fancy word for that called discrepancy monitoring, getting stuck in the gap. Someone wrote a book called The Happiness Trap, and it's really about the gap. It's about how a lot of depression and anxiety is about getting stuck in the gap between what is and what ought to be, what should be, what used to be, what could have been, right? A lot of human distress is about getting stuck in that gap. And getting stuck in insomnia is another particular example of that. So I like a lot of the sense that Dr. Meadows makes, but I have my own compromise method, as I mentioned earlier. So I've got these acronyms. I'm a lover of acronyms because they're easy to remember. I've got another PowerPoint I can share with you guys if you want. It's more of a general orientation to these two acronyms. STFA is a way of understanding problems. So we can understand sleeplessness as a problem. It's a situation that evokes an unhelpful pattern of thinking, and thinking includes attentional focus, feeling, and action tendency. So, most people have a few STFAs that they're focusing on when they come to me. Insomnia might be the only one, or it might be one of a few. NUACT is the solution to STFA. So I want to incorporate all the best stuff from CBTI. I want to incorporate some of what Dr. Meadows is talking about. I think I skipped over Dr. Meadows. His primary, I skipped over a piece that shouldn't be skipped over. His primary, what he's really saying that's different is he's really focusing on clients not getting stuck in control strategies, not regarding even all the CBT stuff, and a lot of it does make sense. He's encouraging clients not to be monitoring to see if it's working. If on any particular night the control strategies that you're using are not working, to just bring attention to the experience that you're having, and if it's sleeplessness, to accept that that's what's happening, to really focus on acceptance of what's here now. You're taking stock of your body. Perhaps you're feeling tired. Perhaps you're frustrated that CBT hasn't worked so far. Simply bringing attention to your thoughts and feelings, taking stock of what is, and fostering an attitude of acceptance, because that is what's going to calm down your nervous system and eventually permit the sleep that you're seeking. So he's got some, a breathing meditation is a helpful thing to do. After you've taken stock of what you're feeling, you can start to track the sensation of your breath. You should be careful not to use this as a control strategy. A lot of clients, they just can't help but get pulled back into using the breathing meditation as a way to sleep. And so they'll do it for a minute or two, and then they'll check, am I sleepy? And if they're not sleepy, they'll have that subtle not liking, which activates the nervous system and which brings them back to a state of wakefulness. If you want more, oh yeah, we already talked about that. Okay, so in my compromise, you would make use of a lot of the sleep hygiene stuff. You would regularize your bedtime as best you can. You would limit naps as best you can, making exceptions where it makes sense to. You would perhaps adopt some of the stimulus control strategies that we listed earlier. You would, for the time being anyway, limit bed to just sleep and not read in bed for a while. Try to get yourself tired by reading in an armchair or reading on the couch and coming to bed when you're tired, but with a general softening of the strictness of these rules. Once you've come to bed, I would recommend that you, if you find yourself sleepless, whether it's waking in the middle or waking too early or struggling to get to sleep, as best you can, you would bring attention to any thoughts and feelings that are there, and you would take stock of what's there, accept but defuse from the thoughts. I'll say more about that in a sec. Thoughts can be noticed and accepted, and then you can shift attention from them. Feelings are not quite the same. You want to notice them and accept them if there's an unpleasant emotion associated with being sleepless. You want to take stock of it and accept it and actually make space for it. Say, well, that feeling's appropriate. I'm going to have that feeling right now. So, with feelings, you don't have that option to shift. If you try to shift attention from a feeling, it's going to grab your attention again very quickly. thoughts, you have imperfect control over your attention, over your thought process. So you can notice that you're having a thought about the consequences of not sleeping. You can notice that. Bring attention to something non-threatening, such as an audiobook. I think audiobooks make a really great intervention for people trying to establish sleep. Because it's non-threatening content, you can set a timer on the audiobook so it turns off after 15 minutes or half an hour, whatever you need. It will tend to occupy your attention. It's much better than trying to watch TV because you can close your eyes, you have a much better chance of falling asleep. You can bring your attention to a creative process, imagining a canvas, and pretending you're an artist, a brilliant artist, and you're filling up that canvas with some beautiful painting. And with your imagination, there's no limitation due to skill, which I happen to suffer from. And then, of course, maybe within seconds or minutes, your attention is once again pulled into thoughts about the frustration of not being asleep. That's okay. You notice that your attention is doing that, and you bring attention back to non-threatening content. And you just repeat that. And it takes practice to get really good at quickly catching unhelpful thoughts, the ones that turn on your nervous system, reliably catching them, quickly catching them. Beginners will often, do this for a while, and then they'll notice that the whole thing as a general project is not working. Gosh, I've been at this for half an hour now, noticing my thoughts, disengaging from them, and yet here I am, just frustrated. I guess I'm not good at this, right? So now you're fused with threatening content again, probably back in my office the next day. I would encourage you to accept even your non-acceptance. So at whatever point your mindful awareness comes into place, whatever's happened prior to that moment, you simply notice and understand and accept. You speak to it with compassion. And then, as best you can, shift attention to non-threatening content that's going to promote sleep. So that's my compromise. I don't know if I've ever talked for 1 hour and 23 minutes straight before, but I'm a bit parched. I'm going to take a break now and open it up to questions. That is actually my final slide, I think. I'm happy to go back to any slides if anybody has a question about earlier content.
I had some things in the chat.
Okay.
One of them is my son has severe migraines and a lot of times has great difficulty getting to sleep.
Okay.
That's I don't know if you want them all at once or you want one at a time.
No, let's deal with that one. My son's in the middle of coping with cluster headaches, which are similar in some ways. Similar in that they're very frustrating, and they can last. They can last for it's been many months with my son's cluster headaches, and so we've had this conversation. I really believe in this compromise approach. Doing the best you can. The pain is very distracting, and the pain can pull you into a whole set of thoughts about that and not liking the pain. There is a specific ACT therapy approach for chronic pain. I can share those materials happily with you and direct you to someone who might be able to help your son with that. And then to really marry that with the sleep intervention. But I think it's really going to be simply doing the best you can, noticing thoughts and feelings about the pain. There can be there's going to be a chain of thoughts and feelings, right? There might be thoughts and feelings about the pain itself, and then that would lead you to thinking about how that's affecting sleep. That could lead you to a thought about how you're going to function the next day because of the reduced sleep. which could lead to some very general thoughts about the futility of life. And those are all quite understandable. When that kind of a very negative chain of thoughts comes up, it could trigger, some very intense distress that's co-occurring alongside physical pain. So what a challenge. I've never personally had to deal with that, just vicariously through my son. And so again, it's a tall order for our client to comply with this acceptance piece. But I really don't see any other option. You do the best you can. And if you do get hooked into thoughts about futility, and that goes on for some time, you notice and you accept and you speak to that with compassion. Getting hooked into futility is quite unhelpful, of course, but who can blame you, right? So at the moment that you're able to gather yourself, you want to notice and understand and accept that negative thought process occurred, and as best you can, come back to a thought process or a focus of attention that's going to move you even some small step in the direction of what you need or what you want. I hope that's helpful. With all due respect to anyone struggling with chronic pain of that nature or other sources.
Thank you. The other next question is, what current research is there on the concept of second sleep?
Oh, I'm not familiar with that term. What is second sleep? Can that person help me out?
You have to unmute yourself though first.
Perhaps I can Google it.
That goes back to the year 15th century and so on, where it was a given that people woke up in the middle of the night, halfway through their sleep. They may get up and do productive work, whether it was anything from chopping wood to sewing to whatever, and that was an accepted practice. Then later on into about the 17th, 18th century, they looked upon it as you should have a full night's sleep. Now, my question, I guess, is there any research into where maybe some people are, I don't know, maybe some genetically predisposed to do that? It's just you wake up in the middle of the night. But again, as you've talked about all of these struggles and thoughts and so on, as opposed to the acceptance, then we make it tougher. Like you said, get up and read, get up and do something, or do something productive. That's why I was wondering if there was any, research, and also read the book. I can't remember the author. It's called Second Sleep, sort of a historical novel and so on. Yeah.
Yes. Well, there's a number of interesting pieces to that. One of them is a genetic predisposition. Certainly that might be the case. I haven't read any research. I'm thinking now about the current practice in, I believe it's still current in Italy, that there's the siesta. People might have a shorter sleep because they're having this siesta in the afternoon, right? Which is essentially a scheduled nap, a culturally shared practice. Certainly we might see genetic variation across subgroups where you'd be more predisposed to having a split sleep or a second sleep. I can imagine that being the case, but I'm quite ignorant about this subject generally, and I'm curious about it now.
Okay.
So if you find that you are, if you've learned about yourself over the course of your life that you are better suited to having two sleeps, then that's what you should do. And you should, and if there's an interruption or a disruption there, perhaps I can help you after brushing up on the research.
No, that's okay. It was just interesting because I've done some reading on it, and it's just an interesting concept because it seems like so many people do wake up in the middle of the night and have a challenge to go back to sleep because they're doing all the things that you were saying that we shouldn't do.
Oh, like what? Like
Well,
what?
like, you know, I mean, thinking about it and
Oh,
you know what I mean,
ah,
saying, oh, how's this
right,
going to affect me tomorrow, and on and on and
right.
on and on.
Yeah.
So we're doing that.
Or I'm awake and I'm not going to be able to get back to sleep.
Yes, right.
Yeah, yeah,
Which is going to wake up your sympathetic nervous system.
yeah,
Right. So perhaps clinicians should make themselves aware that there are subgroups of people where this is actually supposed to happen, and those people should simply accept and then stop trying to fit themselves into a square hole, or vice versa, and find a different schedule that works. Rather than getting distressed, trying to get back to sleep and being distressed about not sleeping, that's not going to be a good solution for those people.
yeah. Okay, well, thank
Thank
you.
you for broadening my horizons. I'm gonna look into that now. Genetic variation. Of course, these genes are spreading, right? And we're seeing less geographically situated, genetic, genotypes, right? We're
Right.
seeing, so you might find, someone who's meant to do that, their ancestors come from one part of the world, but now it's showing up in a different part of the world because of mobility and all that.
Oh, yeah. Yep.
Thank you very much.
All
Yeah,
right.
there's a couple more comments. Marie says, I'm appreciating that direction, paying attention to our relationship to unhelpful thoughts. That's when you were talking about that. And Regina says, when I cannot sleep, I turn my digital alarm clock to 15 minutes. Oh, I do this too. 15 minutes of CBC talk radio, not music, in the middle of the night. And I'm usually asleep before the 15 minutes is up because of the soothing tones of the human voice.
Yeah.
I do that, except the other night it was some kind of rap music and that didn't work.
That didn't work. Yeah.
Next
So,
question. Oh, yeah.
well, 15 minutes of CBC certainly did it for me when I was a kid. And my dad was trying to wean me off of rock music. So I'm sure it would work now as well. But no, rock and rap, probably not so much. Yeah.
Question, what is happening when someone is asleep snoring but does not think they are sleeping?
Right. Well, oftentimes we lose that little span of time. I'm just drawing on personal experience here. I know I do it, and I'll say, geez, I didn't sleep. And she'll be like, yes, you did. and my partner does it too. Sometimes it's a brief period and you just lose those moments and you believe you haven't slept. So you should trust your partner, is my advice.
Another question is, in terms of sleep, should we be targeting a certain number of hours of sleep? I don't sleep well, but I don't feel tired, but I do worry about my sleep.
Okay. So this person, in what way do you not sleep well? You're not matching the average, because the average has a band of error around it, right? 7.4. I think most people fall within one standard deviation, and the standard deviation is almost an hour. So you're going to have outliers. If you're 2 standard deviations away, if you're in the bottom 2%, sorry, if you're in the second percentile, you might need as little as 5.5, right? So so we can see variation, but most people fall plus or minus an hour of 7.4. I think that's the last time I read the meta-analysis. So don't get too caught up in having to be average.
Okay, then perhaps I'm average.
Are you still within the range of average?
Yeah, I think, yeah, within the range of average, but certainly
Yeah.
not matching my partner's.
Okay. And when you say you don't sleep well, was it just that amount factor, or
No,
are you having
broken sleep.
broken sleep? Okay.
Yeah.
And when you wake, how do you regard that? You've been regarding it as a problem, yeah?
When I wake up, I'm bitter.
Oh, and is that because you've learned that broken sleep is bad?
Yeah, I just feel like ripped off.
Ah, something
Like,
would be better if you had uninterrupted sleep.
right.
Well, you'll never find out unless if you can come to accept the sleep that you're having. You might find that your nervous system calms down a bit,
Mm.
and sleep changes in some ways for you. If that's not the case, then perhaps your sleep is just fine the way it is.
Okay. I mean, I'm not tired, so I'm not particularly worried about it. I just don't sleep well.
No troubles controlling attention, emotions, or behavior?
No, not generally.
I was
No.
just at the outset, I listed those problems with suboptimal sleep. There is human variation, and to be honest, I haven't done all that research, as to how much variation. I know about the amount, the variation around the mean score for how much sleep a person needs. I know about that variation. There's probably variation in the degree to which brokenness reflects a problem or not. And I'm not sure if that's a problem. But, if I stick to the thesis of what I've said tonight, you would benefit from coming to accept the pattern that you have. And then perhaps the pattern will change. Perhaps there'll be less brokenness. But you say you're already not tired, and you don't feel that. The only sense that you have that there's a problem is that you've come to believe that broken sleep is bad because other people don't have broken sleep, right?
Right.
Yeah. So to start off with, I would advise you to come to accept the sleep that you're having, and if perceiving a threat is causing that brokenness, then coming to accept the brokenness will reduce that threat perception and therefore allow your nervous system to find what it's supposed to be doing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does, absolutely. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for asking. Good question.
Anybody else have any questions? We had someone who had to leave us, but who said to say thank you for a most informative session.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you.
Just while anybody's thinking up a question, if they have one, if you've enjoyed this presentation and would like to make a donation to help us bring more interesting programming to the community, I'm going to pop a link in the chat, and you can do that there if you're interested. Any other questions for Chris? Chris, where can we find you? Where can people find out more about you?
I'm sorry, you just broke up there. That's the only thing.
I said, where can people find you?
Right. So, yeah. So at the first slide, I've got my website.
Oh, great.
So lifespandevelopment.ca is my website, and everything you need to know is there. I'm in Port Moody and Suderbrook. I'm there 4 days a week, and I'm in Vancouver at Broadway and Birch on Thursdays. So if anyone's out Vancouver way, Thursdays are the day to come see me. And I'm happy to converse by email. And if anyone has any questions for me, you can get me at drjones@lifespandevelopment.ca. So DRJONES at lifespandevelopment.ca.
Thank you. We have another question. Do you have suggestions for helping teens who have reversed their day and night?
Yeah, well, I did mention delay of gratification problems. And also, I don't want to generalize, but so problems with delay of gratification can be can be a disruptor of sleep, right? So there's no primary insomnia or secondary to anxiety, depression. It's just a gradual shifting due to, not wanting to let go of immediate reward. And so it's just a gradual thing that happens to the best of us, right? With teens being a great example of the best of us. It really becomes, the activities that have caused that shift are usually activities that are immediately reinforcing, like, binge watching Netflix or YouTube or video game playing. I have a son who greatly enjoys video game playing, and he's got a great argument for persisting with that until 2, 3, 4 in the morning, especially when there's no school. And my weak response of, yes, but what about your clock? What about your biological clock? It doesn't carry a lot of weight when it comes up against the immediate gratification of playing video games now. Executive function, self-control it's a finite resource, it's renewable, etc. It's also something that you're really going to need in your life. There was a guy in the 70s who asked little kids, 4-year-old kids, were they 3? I think they were 4. He asked them if they'd like one cookie now or 2 cookies later. Or was it marshmallows?
Marshmallows. It was marshmallows.
I'm gonna say, some of the kids who exerted self-control and waited for that two marshmallow payoff were crying. They're sniffing the marshmallow and literally struggling, but and in tears. But they didn't give up, and they wanted that second marshmallow. And those kids, he followed them into their 40s. Walter Mischel, Mischel, if you're interested in that research, he found those kids had all kinds of happy life outcomes, lower divorce rates, greater wealth, greater achievement in many domains of life. Delay of gratification is the strongest predictor of success. And of course, there are things that lead you to flip upside down your day-night schedule. There's people who have no choice. I'm being very long-winded. Sorry. I think you get the gist of what I'm saying. My son's in the background saying, "Dad, you gotta cut it off."
And someone's asking about the opposite, like a younger child, a 9-year-old, helping them to go to sleep.
Yeah. Well, so they've switched around their sleep-wake cycle? The 9-year-old has?
No.
Sounds
Oh,
like
I
it.
guess I'll chime in on that because that isn't clear. The child just seems to, even from a very young age, going to sleep at night is just an absolute challenge. And now that, for the past 2 or 3 years, when she's become an avid reader, she'll read. And that's, I guess, the delayed gratification. But are there any kinds of things that one could try to, their parents have done everything they possibly can. They've read every book in the shelf, I think, but is there any idea that you might have?
It sounds like this is an unusual case. Have the parents brought their child to a counselor or a psychologist?
No.
Okay. This sounds like there's something else going on. It's unusual that the child. I mean, it's great for kids. Kids can use reading, and often it works very well to fall asleep. And then the parent comes in, pulls the book away gently, and turns off the light. So I'm not sure what's causing this. It sounds like something quite unusual. Not to want to, cause fear or anything, but it'd be hard to give a response off the cuff to this situation.
No,
I just want to know more. Yeah.
No, she just doesn't like going to sleep. She's going to miss something. And that-
Yeah, so trouble letting go of the day.
Yeah,
And I don't want to trivialize that and call it, problems with delay of gratification. I can, there sounds like an anxiety issue there, more than just not liking going to sleep. Trouble letting go of the day, fear of missing out, but quite a strong, quite an unusual case there. And I'd really love to talk to this child and find out what are her thoughts and feelings. I'm quite stumped by this. This is quite unusual. Yeah.
okay. Well, I didn't know it was that unusual because you've
Well,
parents
you
all
said that
over.
is this the child who's completely reversed? So she's staying up all night long, or?
Oh, no. It's just that,
Oh,
you could expect someone maybe a couple years ago to be in bed and asleep by shortly after 8. Well, it might be 9, 9:30, 10.
Oh, well, that sounds okay then. Is she having trouble getting up in the morning?
Well, when she has to get up, she's up. Yeah. I mean, you got to get to school.
Okay, and okay, no. So it sounds like she's still getting her 7.5. She's 9. So yeah.
Oh, yeah. She's
Yeah.
definitely.
Okay. I'm sorry.
Yeah, she's
I got a
definitely.
bit confused.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She's
Perhaps I
getting,
didn't sleep well last night. I got a bit confused. I was mixed up with the other child who completely flipped it around. To flip it around with reading is pretty hard to do. Video games I can understand. Yeah. Okay, so that doesn't sound like a big problem. If there was any negative consequence of this extra reading, then it would be about that difficult issue that we all struggle with, and it's about a little bit of pain now for the sake of future happiness.
yeah.
So the flip side of delay of grat is taking on pain now for the sake of future goals, right? They're two sides of the same coin. There's a big issue here for this girl, but it's an issue that, conversation can be enough intervention. Just, you keep checking in with the child, right?
Yeah, well, her
How's
parents
that
are
going?
right on top of it. And as I say, they've probably read most books on the shelf on it. And so they, but I just thought there might be something that could add to it. Okay. Well, thank you.
So I think we're just about at time here, and I just want to thank you again so much for all this wisdom and this wonderful information. If people want to come back next week, we have Dr. Julie Clayton, who is a clinical counselor and happens to have a theological degree, and she's coming to talk to us about ministry and mental health. And then the very last Thursday evening, we have Jennifer Lloyd, who's a nutritionist who's here to talk about gut health. So, and nutrition and your wellness. So lots to come. And those links and all that information can be found on our Facebook page or on our inletunited.ca if you're looking for it. And that's where we'll put the replay as well.
Wow, what a pleasure. I thank you again for this invitation and this experience. This is really, I haven't done a lot of community service, and this is, I think, whet my appetite. So I really appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
All right. Have a great night and a great sleep.
Thank you.
But if it's not great, that's okay.
That's right.
Okay. Bye for now.